Welcome. We are in AP English, and we are now addressing October 2-2. We are addressing today now several logistical issues as we get ready for a presentation on Machiavelli's Prince. I actually want to make some quick observations. First, about the writing assessment number 8, and then about the writing assessment number 9 that comes due next Monday. I want to make a clear observation here. For those of you who were not with us on Friday, I gave the topics for the writing assessments up through number 11. So it's very important that at some point, not now, but at some point you get that information, all right? First of all, I want to point out how crucial it is for you that you are planning in advance the writing assessments. So you do not want to be sitting down on Sunday night to finally ask the question, what's the paper on Stoicism about? And then start some kind of random mad dash through the world of the technologies available to you, Twitter and, emails or texting or whatever, to try to figure out what is it we're supposed to be writing on. We do not want to fall into that kind of habitual compositional approach. It will not serve you well at the next level. With that in mind, number 2, you need to understand what the St. Martin's Guide assignment is in the abstract. What is the kind of paper that I'm being asked to write? Before I even look at Stoicism, I need to have a better sense of what that paper is. So you want to pay close attention to the guidelines. For example, the 297 page and following in your St. Martin's Guide will be talking to you specifically about the Packet 8 paper. So if you haven't looked at that, it doesn't do you a lot of good to know that the paper's on Stoicism. Okay, you need to kind of have some sense there first. I will say then, just to continue this observation, that for packet number 9, you want to be looking at the page 363 writing assessment page from St. Martin's Guide, the proposing a solution. Okay? So in other words, what you're doing is you're taking the paper topic, and then you're working with the assigned text. And some of you are not taking this approach, and that's causing you some problems. Finally, let's make sure we understand now the specific topic for both of these papers, 8 as well as 9. Can I talk about 9 as well, since we're in a process of trying to look ahead? I would recommend that you're always working at least 4 or 5 days in advance. That way, if you have a question about the topic, you can always either email me or come in and sit down with me and we can chat about it. Or you can do what one of you did, and that is say, Mr. McGee, can you talk about this to the class, because I'm aware I'm not the only one that has no real clear idea what this paper was supposed to be about. See, I'm very happy to make a comment like this, but let me say this out loud. I'm not going to do this again on the day that the paper is due. Does that make sense? On the day the paper is due, we're ostensibly too late. All right, and some of you will say, I'm now going to be up all night writing a paper when I should have been writing it over the weekend because I didn't understand, etc. Let's talk number 8 real quickly. Stoicism is a philosophy that is represented by 2 important thinkers, Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. Both of them are mentioned in the Segru lecture you flowed. However, I limited you, although you can mention Epictetus as one more piece of external validation, obviously. I limited you to Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius wrote a series of observations for himself, never meant to be published. They were, after his death, preserved and given the title Meditations. Okay? These were not any kind of a formal representation of Stoicism. You don't even hear the word Stoicism in Meditations. Marcus Aurelius is just writing about his philosophy on life. So, for example, those of you who were doing some kind of word search when you Googled a document called Meditations looking for the word Stoicism, you're not going to find it because he didn't call his philosophy anything. I mean, if you were to have asked Marcus Aurelius what his philosophy was, he would have probably said something about Platonism because he knew Plato. Okay, we will later call it Stoicism, not only because of Marcus Aurelius, but because of Epictetus and, quite frankly, a few other philosophers as well. There is this thing called the Stoic ideal, all right? Now, the best representation of that is Marcus Aurelius in two ways. Most importantly, his life, which is why you notice Segru kept saying this. Not only did this guy suggest that he should live this way, he actually lived this way. Okay, so his life is the first thing. The second will be meditations, okay, where Aurelius kind of outlines what he considers to be the most important elements of his own philosophy, later called Stoicism. All right? Now, the paper that I assigned to you was to take a position on Stoicism. All right? Agreeing or disagreeing with it. To some degree, then, this is not only an academic paper, but it's kind of a reflective piece of writing as well. An easy way to outline this, and I would have said this last week if anybody had said, can you please make sure that we understand what the paper is, I would have said it this way. Select 3 important ideas from meditations with which you either agree strongly or disagree strongly, and that could be the fundamental core of your paper. Okay? So as you're reading, notice, by the way, meditations in the packet I gave to you is very limited. I only gave you just a few pages of meditations. If you want, you can go online and see all of meditations there, okay? It's available to you. Or the Great Books volume, I think 7 is the Marcus Aurelius Meditations in entire. But I gave you enough that you could at least have some sense of what some of his ideas were, okay? That married to the lecture by Segru. Observation.
So if we pick 3 different ideas within Stoicism to talk about, can we agree with 2 of them and disagree with them?
Absolutely. So, for example, a thesis might be, there is much of Stoicism that I can agree with, while other parts I must disagree with, or critique harshly, or however you wish to phrase it. Mr. Batson, question?
Can you take a concept and agree with parts of the concept but disagree with
Absolutely. And I would say that as we are becoming more critical of these ideas, I would hope that that's probably what you're doing. Where, for example, you will say, Machiavelli's probably right in this area, but only right to this extent. Right? In other words, we're not going to say that any of these philosophic positions are either or kinds of propositions. In other words, either you completely take Stoicism or you don't take any of it. Right?
I was having a hard time with this paper because of just, I guess, the actual fact of Stoicism. It was kind of back and forth. It was contradicting itself a lot, and it was kind of starting to confuse me.
And it might be the case that you find a certain inherent contradiction in Stoicism that will be one of the major critiques of your paper. In other words, I find Stoicism to be somewhat contradictory in this regards, A, B, C, however you wish to do it. Okay. That's as well another opportunity to write your paper.
And if we don't decide to take that course, do we, the things that we're critiquing, is it better to go and put like his work in there that shows that why it's bad or why it's good?
Very much.
And to leave out the stuff that contradicts it?
Of course. How you will like to do that, I'll kind of leave to you.
Or would you rather like put both sides in there?
I will leave that to you. Okay. That's kind of a stylistic decision. But what I would say that Ms. Eves pointed out, very important, is you want to be sure that you are using the Marcus Aurelius lines as internal validation. That is to say, quote from Meditations. Does that make sense? Okay. Well, what is Stoicism? Let's just give the rough, down and dirty, 3-point argument of Stoicism, shall we? And maybe this will help some of you as well. I realize the difficulty of flowing a Segru lecture especially, because Segru works predominantly, at least in that lecture, extemporaneously. So you'll find that he kind of comes back to ideas and he recapitulates or repeats them, and there's not always a real sense of uniformity in his presentation style. The fact that he is one of Princeton's top profs allows him to get away with that, I suppose, you see. And so let's maybe just say real quickly, what is Stoicism as a philosophic system that both Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and any number of other thinkers, we think, of course, of applied Stoicism and Plotinus. I mean, there's a lot of thinkers that will be heavily influenced by meditations. One, probably most importantly, it is a very naturalistic view of existence. What do I mean by naturalism? Well, everything is going to be defined as what is here and now. There's not going to be a lot of mysticism in Stoicism. There's not going to be talk of heaven and hell and afterlife and moral judgments that are contingent upon whether God is in favor of you and all of those kinds of things. In fact, it's interesting if you want to really get into the history of Marcus Aurelius, he actually disapproves of Christian theology for this very reason. For this very reason. In other words, we don't need to have arguments, he would argue, about whether there are gods or not to behave morally correct. Okay, so to that degree, it's what we call a very naturalistic philosophy. Number two, Stoicism is a philosophy that very much emphasizes individual freedom, control. Now, it's here that there seems to be a paradox. On the one hand, the universe is constructed in such a way that you can't control anything. In other words, to say it less than academically, poop happens. That's just the way it is, right? It's just the way it is. Some of those things appear to be good. Some of those things appear to be bad. Who is to say? There is no real way to know whether events in the universe are good or bad. They just happen. That's the naturalism I just talked about. But now my second point is, Aurelius is going to argue that in the middle of all of this naturalism, there is this thing called human choice. What later theologians will actually call agency. You could make the argument that St. Augustine, who invents in many ways theologically the notion of free will, later named agency, will in fact derive its origination from Marcus Aurelius and proceed into that, of course, Socrates, Plato, who argues, Stoicism argues, that the only control you ever have in this world is the control about your own opinions regarding the events of the universe. That is to say, things that happen, the death of, for example, a dear loved one, or if somebody is mean to you. Okay, both sets will be for Marcus Aurelius. You can respond by choosing to decide how you will interpret it. The best way I know how to teach this, if I have to lecture on Stoicism, I usually will provide this line. I don't know that I use this line in my lecture on Republic 7, but it's one that I think can work. A number of years ago, many years ago actually, I was asked by a student, believe it or not, Mr. McGee, you've read one or two books, you've obviously come across a few ideas. All the stuff you've ever read, can you reduce it all down to one line? I like a question like that. It challenged me, and it took me a while. But I kind of came to this line as a way to talk about this second point that I'm talking about in regards to Stoicism. And in fact, a student then took this line, painted it on large orange butcher paper, you know that large paper, and taped it across my ceiling. And for many years in room 303, my room was a collage. At that time, the entire room was completely covered. All of my seniors had taken out over the years all of the tiles, the senior pranks, and they had painted on them. And the entire room was a work of art, you see. And this stayed across the top of my... So I would often find students just looking up and reading the sign, you see, over the course of the semester and years. The sign said this: no longer ask. I've had seniors who actually write this down and stick it in their locker because they find it such a powerful, powerful single statement. No longer ask, why is this happening to me? Rather, learn to ask, why is this happening for me? This is the meaning of life. Now, you're not going to find, unless you read some of my publications, you're not going to find that line specifically anywhere in Marcus Aurelius, or for that matter in Plato, or for that matter in Plotinus. And yet I feel pretty confident that Marcus Aurelius would hear that line and go, you got it, that's exactly right. I'll go back over it. Events happen daily. Second by second events happen, we would say, correct? Many of them happen, of course, and we're a part of those events. Not all, but some. Our instincts when things happen that we don't like is to ask the wrong question. Marcus Aurelius would say the wrong question. Why did this have to happen to me? Think about what that question does in regards to you. It immediately posits you as a victim in a universe where all of these events kind of conspire against you. Why did this happen to me? But let's point out something. That question is an unanswerable question. About any given answer that an outsider could give to you as to why this happened to you, you can always have a response back. Imagine in my you remember my theodicy presentation, I talked about the young daughter dying of leukemia and the mother asking, why does this have to happen to me? Any number of people could give pietistic, theological, and even religious answers to the question, your daughter had to die because of blah, 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 blah. But about any of those answers, the mother could always come back still and say, yeah, but it's not fair. Why did it have to happen to me? Why did it happen to my daughter? Why doesn't it happen to bad people and to their children? Why does it have to... See, you could always invent another question, and to that degree, forever, the question, why did this happen to me, is an unanswerable question. Marcus Aurelius would go so far as to say it would lead one to philosophic suicide. You're never going to come up with a good enough answer if your preposition is to. Why did this happen to me? But there is powerful, profound freedom in changing the preposition from to for. Why did this happen for me? Now notice how immediately that completely changes the whole notion of you as victim in regards to a universe of unanswerable causes. In the moment you ask, why did this happen for me, you are no longer a victim. You are now in charge of your life in the regards that you can interpret any kind of event as being beneficial for you. Propedeutic, we use the term, instructional. Now that's not to say that when terrible things happen to you, you go, yay, bad things happen to me so that I can invent reasons. No. This is not going to be the understanding of Stoicism. Rather, it's not we're diminishing the terrible things that happen. Rather, we're asking about any event that happens, good or bad. Why did it happen for me? How do I learn from this kind of experience? And in that moment, you have a choice. The choice that you make is to determine whether the event for you is instructional. Now, years ago, I was giving a lecture in Houston at the conference center there, and I made this observation. And a young lady stood up in the middle of the presentation and said, I don't see how you can say that. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, I was abused as a child, terribly abused. How can you ask me to think about that abuse as why did this happen for me? Because clearly I was a young girl. It's not like I had any control over the events that were happening to me. Now that is a fundamental question to Stoicism. And Marcus Aurelius would answer, I think, the way I answered, and that is, well, of course, we're not saying that you had any control over the events that happened to you. But then that's true for most of our lives. I mean, if you start analyzing the events that happened yesterday, most of those events are outside of your control. It is a myth to imagine otherwise. You got in a vehicle assuming the brakes would work. That is an assumption. You got in a vehicle assuming everybody that was on the road would follow the same laws of the road as you. That is an assumption. We're familiar with people who come slamming into the back of you and you become a paraplegic the rest of your life. You had no control over that either. Now, of course, her situation is even more extreme. And so my response to her was to say two things. One, clearly we're not saying anything that happened to you was not tragic and horrible. We're clearly saying that. But the question is, if you ask why it happened to you, that is forever an unanswerable question. We could, for example, start to backtrack, Freudian-like, to the father, for example, who was terrible to her, who maybe himself was abused. Well, why was that abuse happening? And just continue infinite regress over and over and over again. We'll come up with answers that inevitably will have a secondary kind of response. Well, why did that have to happen to that person? And on and on and on. But I did ask her this. I said, do you have any interest in someday having children? She said, I do. I said, will you ever allow that kind of terrible trauma to happen to your children? Never. I said, but imagine what you just said in terms of the powerful feelings that you have regarding that terrible moment. And imagine the ways in which you someday will have the capacity to sit with a young girl who has had that terrible experience. And you will be able to say to her, I know what you're going through. Lots of therapists don't have that because they don't have the terrible trauma in their early childhood of that experience. We're not saying it's good. We're saying it's useful. That's fundamental Stoicism. We're not debating whether it's good or bad. We're asking, can it be useful? And Stoicism says you have the freedom to decide, yes, it can be a propedeutic. Yes, it can be useful. About that we often ask a simple biographic question. Some of the most terrible things that happened to you, maybe they were embarrassing, maybe they were painful, about them, after the fact, you often have the capacity to see, while I wouldn't ever want to go through it again, I guess I have to admit, I learned something through the experience. In that moment, you have agreed with Stoicism on this fundamental principle of freedom. Mr. Keller, I'm sorry to keep you waiting.
So, like, where would the philosophy of a Stoic diverge from a Transcendentalist? Because they sound really similar.
This is a great question. Of course, now, Mr. Kelleher is asking me about Transcendentalism. Let's apply that word and a date in our day plan, or in our notes, at roughly 1800. By 1800, 1800 Common Era, we have a number of thinkers who, on both sides of the Atlantic, both in Europe as well as in America, are understanding the power of Stoicism in regards to this notion of personal freedom, right? You could argue that Immanuel Kant plays the game of applied Stoicism. Many have. And from Kant, of course, the names are then legion. We, of course, will apply Transcendentalism as a name to the three great Transcendentalists we call American Transcendentalists, of Ralph Waldo Emerson. I think we read a bit of him last year. Henry David Thoreau, I think we read a bit of him as well last year. And then finally, of course, the great poet, American poet Walt Whitman. All three of those important Transcendentalist American thinkers will look at Stoicism and applied Stoicism and say it's the greatest philosophy for freedom. It allows for individuals to decide what is freeing for them, and in that moment, useful. Okay? So, Mr. Kelleher is absolutely right. Let's kind of set the trajectory this way, maybe on a timeline for yourself. In many ways, Plato is the inventor of this idea. Okay? Aristotle has some real difficulty at times with this notion. Okay? Which is why, for example, he supports the idea of having slaves. You can kind of see how that's counterintuitive to your notion of freedom. But the next step in this is roughly 200 Common Era, when Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius are playing a game. Remember, Epictetus is himself a slave, and yet he says, I am free as long as my mind is free. You can't control my mind unless I allow you to, even if I'm a slave. By the way, that's Marcus Aurelius' line, a man can live well even in a palace. That's his point. The idea is that you have the choice. From those two Stoic philosophers, the next major step, we would argue, will be the great Roman thinker Plotinus, who's a thinker, mystic. And then we'll use probably roughly 410, St. Augustine, who will as well play this game in terms of applying Platonism. And then Immanuel Kant, who will be the great German philosopher who plays the game again. You could argue, by the way, that Hegel does the same thing. All right? And to some degree, you could argue Friedrich Nietzsche plays the same game. So there is a history here of thinkers that will influence very much American thinking, no doubt about it. We said it last year as American students, students of American literature, that Transcendentalism kind of sets the course. Let's say it now, because it is an extremely optimistic philosophy. Okay. Now, there are departure points I should suggest, Mr. Kelleher. There are things that Emerson said that probably Marcus Aurelius would say, yeah, okay, well, you know, I guess I can see where you're coming from, but I don't know that I necessarily will go that far, especially the more poetic elements. But remember, Emerson was raised Christian. So he'd been influenced by St. Augustine's theology, which obviously Marcus Aurelius had no advantage of. Okay? Question?
Okay, and I guess that kind of ties in with, like, Stoicism is, when I looked it up and tried to actually define it, it said impassive to pain and pleasure.
Yes.
But then, like, it goes back to, it says, like, in one of his works, it says, never show anger or any other passion.
Right.
So if you do that, like, so it means like you have your freedom because your mind is set straight, but you're not going to say anything about it?
That's right. So, for example, this directly, I think, speaks to Mr. Kelleher's question about transcendentalism. He would agree with Emerson's notion that there's freedom in the universe. He would have difficulty with Emerson jumping up and down about it, maybe we would say, getting all excited or Twitter-pated about it. For Marcus Aurelius, he would say, why write books on it gets dark at night? If you want to tell me, it's the famous line when the Dalai Lama was met by the mother who said, I'm so sad because I'm dying of cancer. And the Dalai Lama said back, oh, that's interesting, I'm dying too. And she went, I hadn't read that. And he said, I was dying the moment of my conception. See, we just have a tendency to forget this fact. This is exactly, remember, this is exactly what Plato says in Book 7 of Republic. Remember, the sitting in the cave, it's not that those people are bad. All right? Understand the powerful optimism of this view. SS guards who burned human beings for Plato, not bad. Not bad people. They are ignorant. Now, by ignorant, what does he mean? They live in a cave. They live in a cave. They don't understand that what they're doing is damaging their own soul. Right? They don't understand it. That is to say, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Not forgive them because they're wretched people. I'm obviously quoting a very famous line by a very famous individual who himself was being treated somewhat unfairly at the moment that he said it. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. See, this is fundamental Stoicism. In other words, people behave the way they behave because they don't know. Now, let's point out, this can be debated. See, Plato believes that if you know the truth, you will act the truth. The only sin, for Plato and for Marcus Aurelius, is to forget. Forget what? We're all human, and therefore we're all going to die. It doesn't matter what you try to do to somehow counterbalance that. Now, St. Augustine will take that philosophy, inject it into his Christian theology, and for him it works very well as well. Okay? Finally, number 3. Stoicism seeks to try to understand how communities can cohabitate. And here, he's going to sound very conservative. His view will be simply that there are laws, those laws must be obeyed. Whatever those laws are, they have been constructed by some individual or individuals, and for the greater good, they must be obeyed. So if, for example, we have a state religion, if we're Marcus Aurelius in 180, Common Era, we have a state religion, and all of a sudden we have individuals who start to challenge that state religion. They will soon be known as followers of this Christus or Christians. They must be dealt with harshly. Aurelius, believe it or not, is one of the key emperors to attack and kill Christians, which, by the way, is one reason why, Segru kept going on and on about how great this guy is, and yet you'll have, he's not at all support. Why? Because this is a subgroup, in his estimation, that's trying to counterbalance or turn upside down public harmony. This takes us right back to the philosophy of Plato. How do we find institutional harmony? How can we all be one family, be friends, and get along? The answer, of course, for Aurelius is you have to have dominant, strong leaders. They need to be wise people. He's very influenced by Plato in this regards. And the polis must follow the rules. Okay? Now, this debate will become foundational to political theory. So, for example, English Enlightenment will say, okay, I agree with that idea that we all should follow the rules and we shouldn't all jump up and down and kill each other. But what happens when a king, for example, starts to behave in a tyrannical way? Well, think about your American experience. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just consent from the governed. Remember what Jefferson said? But whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish that form of government and to set up a form of government that shall preserve their security and happiness. Remember that? That is a radical notion. Aurelius would have difficulty with an idea like that. He would have difficulty, because you're saying revolution. You're saying overturning the system that is in place. And in that process, you could create serious disharmony that would lead to external forces intruding, ultimately taking over. That's called 410 Rome, when Rome falls. In other words, dissension from within the community, for Aurelius, can lead to externals that are indefensible. Which, of course, if you study the history of the world, seems to be the way great empires fall. The perception is they fall from the outside. Enemies infiltrate. But if you study the history of that institution, that community, that state, that republic, you will notice that the disharmony within the group began to somehow loosen the fabric that created the harmony, the unity, and that was the reason why that power fell from external intrusion, from external invasion. They're symbiotic. They go together. And Aurelius was very attuned to this. In some ways, he was kind of a prophet. I mean, we're roughly 200 years before the fall of Rome with Marcus Aurelius, and he kind of saw it. I mean, he looked up and he kind of saw. We have such independence that we all have our own ideas. Then what? And what's going to keep us kind of citizens? And that's an important word for Aurelius. You might jot that down, the word citizen, to be a denizen of the polis.
See, and this is where I get confused, because he says that you must obey this law, and if you don't, there will therefore be consequences.
Right.
But he also says that you're not supposed to react to things like that.
Right. I would say, maybe, Miss Eves, you're being kind of caught on his word react. And here I'll step out of Roman theology and philosophy, and I'll step into Chinese for a moment. Because the Taoists have a really good way to talk about this. It's called Wu Wei. Wu Wei is the way that Taoists talk about this. Unattentive attention is the way they talk about it. In other words, you behave in certain ways because you're supposed to. But about that behavior, you're not so tied to it so tightly that you become so emotionally involved in it that it affects your well-being one way or the other. Let me give you an example. I'll jump to a different place. The Bhagavad Gita says it this way. You have the right to work. This is, by the way, from Gita 2, for those of you who followed the Hindu texts, the Bhagavad Gita, Gita 2. You have the right to work, but for the work's sake only. You have no right to the fruits of your labor. Desire for the fruits must never be your motive in working, but then the passage finishes by saying, never give way to laziness either. So in other words, you work, but you don't necessarily tie the outcome of that work to your freedom or to your identity. You do everything within your power to be a good person, but there's no guarantee people will treat you nice. Remember? Forgive them, for they know not what they do.
So it's kind of like go with the flow.
To go with the flow, I think Aurelius would say, yes, when you understand that all of existence, and this is kind of the physics side of this philosophy, says all of existence is kind of like a river in flow, yeah. All right, guys, well, what we didn't get to is the prince. So I'm thinking maybe we'll do prince tomorrow. Thank you.
Would you be willing to sign off on my test sheet now? I had